The unsurpassed, penetrating, and perfect truth is seldom met with, even in 100,000 myriad kalpas. Now we can see and hear it. We can remember and accept it. To make the Buddha's truth one with myself. Homage to the Buddha, homage to the Dharma, homage to the Sangha. Well, it's good to see you all, those of you who have been here for the weekend for the first time, and other friends who come regularly. I'm going to talk, hopefully not too lengthily today, on a subject dear to my heart these days. And I'm calling this an ancient and eternal law, quoting the Buddha. And so I'll start with an oft-quoted teaching of Shakyamuni Buddhas from the Dhammapada. You've all heard it many times, no doubt. And it's as relevant today as it was in his time, and perhaps even more so now, when we find ourselves, at least some of us, feeling we're in turbulent and sometimes distressing times, with perhaps a lot of divisiveness going about, quarreling and so on. So this is something that I've found very deeply comforting and helpful in my own training. So the quote is as follows. The Buddha said, usually he gave these sayings, by the way, after something happened and by way of offering a teaching that was relevant to whatever the situation was that he was dealing with. He says, "For never in this world do hatred cease through hatred. Through love alone do the end. This is an ancient and eternal law." Or you could say an ancient and eternal Dharma. The Buddha, upon awakening to the truth as a younger man, said that he had uncovered an ancient path, a path to an ancient city, as if it had been overgrown by a jungle, but he rediscovered it. So he didn't make this all up. It was something that he came upon that had already existed, perhaps in a different time, in a different form. He had his own unique way of offering it. But I'd like to draw out that aspect of this particular teaching today, and perhaps address also in particular how our training helps us to deal with anger and feelings of hatred, conflicts that we might feel ourselves pulled into. I'll just touch a little on what we mean by love in Buddhist practice. Through love alone do hatred cease, he says. Just very simply, in my own experience, the simple practice that we do, sitting still with anger, with fear, is an act of love in itself. Letting go of our selfish impulses when they arise, sitting still with these. So therefore, underlining the importance of our practice. Those of you who have come here this weekend have learned, some of you perhaps had been meditating, you've learned about or deepened your spiritual practice here, I hope. Learned hopefully how to establish yourself or begin to in serene reflection, meditation, and mindfulness of the Buddhist precepts in your daily life. To my mind, these practices, these simple practices that we do every day, are an act of love. They are the most loving thing that you can do for yourself and for others. So it's not far away. We think that we have to do something heroic or find some special state of mind, and that's not the case at all. When the Buddha taught about practicing loving kindness and compassion, he always emphasized that we start by offering that love towards ourselves. Unless we can really embrace ourselves and every part of ourselves, as we learn to do in the just sitting practice that we do, it's very hard to truly to offer pure love to others. Yeah. So gradually then, as we learn to do that, he instructs us to expand that loving kindness or compassion to embrace those close to us, perhaps easier to love, and eventually to acquaintances and strangers, and eventually to those whom we dislike, even our enemies, if we feel we have enemies. I remember when I was a young person, probably 20 years old, 21 years old, I first encountered Buddhism when I was living in London, England, and I went to a Theravadan Buddhist center, and they taught me loving kindness meditation. So that was one of my first contacts with Buddhism. And they taught me this and asked me to, and suggested also I offer loving kindness to my enemies. And we grew up in Canada, and I honestly could not think of any enemies. So I felt very fortunate. I didn't have any enemies, not yet. But perhaps at an early age I learned to try not to create enemies in my mind. Yeah, we'll talk a little bit more about what that means in practical matters later. Sometimes we don't exactly know what loving kindness means. But again, just by doing our regular meditation practice, bringing our attention to what we're doing at all times, doing our best to be mindful of our attitude of mind, the attitude of mind that we bring to everything we do, with regards to the precepts, with regards to whether we're engaging in harmful thoughts, speech, actions, or beneficial ones. Again, I'd like to emphasize this itself is a great act of love and the most loving thing we can do. Of course, the Buddha is not referring to conjuring up some fuzzy emotional state. He's also not talking about repressing feelings as they arise. There's a middle way here that is real. It puts us in touch with a reality that we all share, a common ground that we share with all beings. And a big part of it is just letting go of the our clinging to a selfish self, to our own self-centered concerns. Identifying with that aspect of ourselves, perhaps that feels it's separate or isolated from others and from the unborn, the undying, the unchanging, which is the source of pure love and compassion, of course, and which we all have the ability to know fully for ourselves. Well, you've had a lot of instruction this weekend, those of you who've come to this retreat, and also today with the Shushogi. I don't feel I can add an awful lot to that. It's so rich, and I hope you'll feel welcome to take some of our publications with you and study that further. I thought you might enjoy a story, so I'm going to read you a story, if you'd like to. I often will do this sort of thing for a children's class, a kids' Dharma class, and we haven't had too many of those lately, not too many kids coming, so you get to be the big kids and hearing the story. It was rather a good one, and it is, let's see, it's a story from actually the Buddhist Vinaya, the early Vinaya, about a Prince Digavu, and it could be based on a true story, as they often say. It seems to be. The Buddha taught his monks, male and female monks, by various methods, instructing. He gave lectures and discourses and dialogues, and he often used stories to illustrate teaching, and in particular to his monks, to encourage them to follow the precepts. So the Vinaya are the precepts for male and female monastics, and we have our own version of that in our tradition. So personally, I like stories. They're very effective. I remember stories. And here we go. This one is called Prince Digavu, and I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly. Probably a Sanskrit name. Once, some monks who could not stop quarreling came to the Buddha to ask his advice. "Brothers," the Buddha calmly replied, "I have told you many times that fights and quarrels solve no problems, yet you continue. Remember, even some kings with great and powerful armies have learned gentleness. So much the more that you, living the holy life without possessions, should be like light in the world, known far and wide for kindness. Listen now to this story of a noble prince who became a true hero in the world. Once upon a time, two kingdoms lay side by side. One kingdom belonged to the king of Kasi, a powerful ruler who possessed a great army and treasuries bursting with gold. But in the nearby kingdom of Kosala, this is in ancient northern India, lived a much poorer king. He led a meager army, possessed little gold, and held sway over a modest territory. And just as you might guess, the powerful king of Kasi eyed the small kingdom of Kosala and decided he should conquer it. When the king of Kosala heard that a large garrison was headed his way, he knew he didn't stand a chance. To avoid any bloodshed, he counseled with his ministers and decided to immediately surrender his army. As the attacking warriors approached, the king of Kosala slipped away to the city's edge, he and the queen disguised as humble potters. After a time, concealed among the common folk, the queen gave birth to a beautiful baby boy. He was secretly named and crowned Prince Dikavu. They so loved their new son that the king and queen's only concern became his safety. The king feared that somehow at some time in the future the royal family would be recognized. He felt it was only a matter of time. A spy would see through their disguises and kill them all. So with heartfelt loss, the king and queen of Kosala sent their young prince away to be raised in the countryside. Alas, a dozen years later, events occurred exactly as the king had feared. The present barber of the king of Kasi had once been the barber to the poorer king, and one day, in the hubbub of the busy marketplace, the barber recognized the disguised king. He easily saw through the king's charade. The barber fell back into the crowd and secretly pursued the king to discover where he now lived. Then the barber reported right away to the king of Kasi, knowing that he would be richly rewarded for the information. I have news that right within the walls of this city live both the king and queen of Kosala. I, who know the king's face better than any, saw it with my own eyes. They live in a potter's shed and are disguised as beggars. When the king of Kasi heard this report, he feared that if the old king and queen were yet alive, they had 100 reasons to seek his own death and the return of their kingdom. Disguised or not, he anticipated they would find an opportunity to kill him. So he commanded his guards, "Go now to the potter's shed near the outskirts of town. Arrest the old king and queen. When you find them, it will be their last hour. Bind their arms, shave their heads, bring them outside the gates of the city and destroy them." And thus the guards were dispatched to capture the couple. But very early this same day, the young Prince Dikavu awoke full of longing to be with his parents. Now, old enough to travel from village to city alone, he reasoned, "It's been months since I've seen my parents. I would so like to visit with them today. I will make them a present of ripened fruit and delicious cheese from the country." And so the prince cheerfully gathered a few gifts, packed some clothing and money, and set out for the city. By this time, however, the guards had found the royal couple just exactly where the barber had betrayed them to be. They bound their arms tightly with thick rope and dragged them roughly through the streets. But the king and queen walked with dignity, even as they reached the city gates where they knew they would soon die. And so it came to pass that just as Prince Dikavu was entering the city, he witnessed his parents being led to their deaths. In desperation, he made his way to the front of the surrounding crowd. Just at the moment he spied his parents, they too saw him amidst the mob. When the prince neared within earshot, his father shouted, "Dear Dikavu, do not look long, do not look short, for hatred is not stopped by more hatred. No, dear one, hatred ends only by love." The soldiers thought the old king had lost his mind. "Who's this Dikavu? What gibberish you speak?" But the king cautioned Dikavu twice more in the same way, finishing, "He that is intelligent will understand my meaning." These were the king's last words. As swords fell upon his parents' heads, the anguished prince said a silent farewell so as not to reveal his own identity. Prince Dikavu went to the nearby forest and fell to the ground. In agony he wept and wept until he could weep no more. Under the empty sky, he considered the terrible murder of his parents and devised a plan to recover his family's honor. First, he returned to the city and purchased some liquor for the soldiers standing guard over his parents. When the guards succumbed to the alcohol and fell asleep, the prince performed a funeral by the city gates. But at the same exact moment, from atop the splendid palace tower, the king of Kasi happened to see the prince paying his respects to the murdered king and queen. "Alas," said the king in great alarm, "what misfortune will happen now? I will still have no safety or peace of mind, while someone who cares for them wishes to revenge their deaths." Well, and so it came to pass that very day, Prince Dikavu embarked on such a plan. He went to the king's elephant stable and asked that the elephant trainer teach him his art. The trainer agreed to take on the eager apprentice. As part of the prince's secret plan, he rose each day at dawn to play the lute and sing to the entire palace compound. His lovely songs were haunting and captivating. Just as the prince had hoped, the king of Kasi, standing on his palace balcony, heard the enchanting voice and asked his attendants from whence it came. "Your Majesty," they replied, "it is the elephant trainer's new apprentice." "Bring him to me," commanded the king. "I must meet the one who possesses such a gift." All was proceeding exactly in accord with Prince Dikavu's plan. He came before the king, strummed the lute even more beautifully, and sang his most soothing melodies. The king was utterly charmed. "Young man," said the king, "such a voice comes only from one with the finest sensibilities and depth of feeling. I would like you to have the honor of being my manservant." So, Prince Dikavu, still unknown for his real identity, became the king's personal attendant. He rose before the king, preparing the king's affairs. He retired at night, long after the king, securing the king's affairs. And he obeyed the king's every command in between. And in due time, the king appointed Prince Dikavu as counselor and confidant, just as the prince had hoped. But Prince Dikavu's secret and grand scheme was far from complete. A year or so later, the prince had the chance he had worked and waited for. It so happened that one balmy spring day, the king wished to go for a chariot ride. To Prince Dikavu he requested, "Harness the chariot, my best man. I wish to go hunting in the forest, and I want you alone to drive me." "Yes, your Majesty, right away," obeyed the prince. A magnificent chariot of gold and lapis was harnessed to 2 steeds. The prince firmly held the reins and hurried the chariot towards the city's perimeter. As the city's gates opened wide for the royal chariot, Prince Dikavu saw the king's army go in the direction of the eastern forest. The prince steered the chariot towards the west. "I believe the hunting will be better in these quieter woods, sire," he assured the king. "Very well, my man, let us try it out," replied the king. The day was cloudless, and after an hour of travel, the heat oppressive. The sultry midday sun made the king grow drowsy. "My man, unharness the chariot," he mumbled. "I'm tired, and I wish to lie down in the shade of some trees." "Yes, your majesty," complied the prince. The prince watered and hobbled the horses, then rested beside the king under a large banyan tree. The king placed his trusting head in the prince's lap and fell immediately to sleep. With the king's safety resting utterly in the hands of Prince Dikavu, the prince's plan was nearly complete. As the prince looked upon the sleeping king, he thought to himself, "The king of Kasi has done me as much harm as any man could. He has murdered my mother and father. He's robbed our kingdom of its treasury and territory. He has destroyed the honor of the kingdom of Kosala. Now is the time for me to avenge my hatred." Ever so quietly, the prince unsheathed his sword. But as he raised his sword over the king, ready to inflict his punishment, his father's last words seemed to shout within him, "Dikavu, hatred is not stopped by more hatred. No, dear one, hatred ends only by love." Prince Dikavu could not disobey his father's dying words. He could not kill this unsuspecting king. The prince slowly sheathed his sword. But then the same thought of revenge, the thought that had been his mission since the day of his parents' deaths, rose in him more strongly. He had waited years for this moment. Again, he unsheathed his sword. But, alas, he stopped himself once more. He could not act against his father's last wish. He could not end his hatred with another murder. Suddenly the king awoke and sat bolt upright, pale and terrified. The prince's internal struggle abruptly ended. "Your Majesty," said the prince, "whatever has occurred? Why did you wake so alarmed?" The king gasped, "Right now in my dream, the son of the king of Kosala, the heir and prince, wanted to kill me by sword. He was going to sever my head. I thought I was about to die." Then Prince Dikavu, gently touching the neck of the king with his left hand and drawing his sword with the other, told him the truth. "I, your Majesty, am that prince. I am Prince Dikavu, son of the king of Kosala. You have robbed my people of food, territory, and treasure. You have even killed my own mother and father. This would indeed be the time to show my hatred and exact my revenge." At that admission, the king fell upon his knees at the feet of the prince and begged for forgiveness. "Grant me my life, dear Dikavu, grant me my life," wept the king. In his heart, Prince Dikavu now realized what his father had meant for him to learn. He told the king of his father's forgiving words, his last words, and how they stopped the prince from ending the king's life. The prince proclaimed that he would no longer carry this terrible hatred. "Although I have the power to grant you your life at this moment," said the prince to the king, "you also have the power to grant me my life, for you can assure my safety in your kingdom." "This is true," agreed the king. "Grant me my life now, and I'll forever grant you yours. We will no longer be enemies, but vow to live in peace." At that, the prince and king swore an oath never to harm one another and to protect each other's well-being. Peaceful now, with a warm feeling of forgiveness, the two men harnessed the horses, remounted the chariot, and leisurely made their way back to the palace. When the king returned to his court, he gathered all his ministers and counselors together. "Tell me, sirs," asked the king, "if it happened that you laid eyes upon Prince Dikavu, son of the king of Kosala, what would you do?" A minister immediately spoke up. "Your Majesty, we would kill him on the spot." "Yes," shouted another, "we would chop off his head and cut him to pieces." Many voices rose in a cacophony of agreement. But the king said, "Hush, sirs. In front of you is Prince Dikavu, son of the king of Kosala." A great, astonished silence filled the hall. The king continued, "You may not harm him. He has granted me my life, and I have granted him his." The king turned to the prince. "I would like you to tell them, young prince, the marvelous meaning of your father's last words." All eyes in the court turned to the prince. He looked at his audience with courage and forgiveness. "When my father said to me in his hour of death, 'Look not long, dear Dikavu,' what he meant was, do not hold on to hatred. Do not nurture it. When, Your Majesty, my father spoke, 'Look not short,' what he meant was, do not lose friends easily. Be the most loyal of friends." When my father said, "Hatred is not stopped by more hatred," what he wanted me to learn was this: the king has had my mother and father killed. Were I to kill Your Majesty, your people would want to kill me, and my people would want to kill those who had harmed me. Hatred would not end by further hatred. On and on it would go, with many lives lost and many hearts broken. But now, continued the prince, turning towards the king, Your Majesty has given me my life and safety, and I have done the same for you. So by love and forgiveness, we have stopped this terrible cycle of hatred." The king blessed the prince. "O counselors, is it not remarkable how deeply the prince understands his father's brief words?" And thus the king returned to Prince Dikavu the army, territory, and treasure that rightfully belonged to the kingdom of Kosala. The prince and the king's own daughter were soon married, and they all lived in peace, 2 kingdoms side by side peacefully. "And so I say to you," declared the Buddha to the monks after he finished the story, "enough of fighting. This is my advice, good brothers." And the Buddha returned to the solace of his meditation. So, I should enjoy them. I rather did. And stories can sometimes remain with you, but it shows the power of the Dharma, the power of teaching. And it just takes 1 or 2 lines of Dharma to stop one from doing something that one would perhaps regret for the rest of one's life. So never underestimate the value and power of this Dharma that you're hearing. And if you just remember 1 line of it after you leave here, remember, stick with that. Well, I don't have to explain that. I think it speaks for itself. But we might think, well, it's very dramatic, and it happened a long time ago, and we have different laws now, and these kinds of things don't happen. But actually, they do. These kinds of things are happening all the time, in big ways and in small ways. These kinds of quarrels and conflicts are going on within our own minds all the time. So perhaps next time our sword becomes unsheathed, as it were. I like the metaphor of the anger, the sword being the anger, the hatred. I think of hatred as perhaps a sustained anger, sort of something that you kind of really hang on to for a long time, which is particularly dangerous. And the Buddha, in one of many of his teachings, he often cautioned people to be careful that we are generally not aware of the danger of clinging to our greeds and our anger and our delusion. it takes quite a few years of training to begin to realize, oh, this is really dangerous. This is toxic. This really hurts. And it's far more dangerous than any physical, natural disaster or anything else that'll ever happen to you. Much more dangerous because it'll go on from life to life until it gets converted. So just something to add to this in terms of contemplation. So if our sword becomes unsheathed, it doesn't mean that we don't have feelings and that they will arise. But fear will often lead to anger, so be mindful when they do arise. We do not have to act on these things, and even if we have, we can do the best we can to clean it up and apologize if we need to. And the greatest remedy, in my mind, is doing our meditation practice and studying the precepts, really. It can help us to not enter into those areas of clinging. It naturally just cuts through the fetters that bind us to the clinging to greed, anger, and delusion. So trust that those practices that you've learned today, or this weekend, I mean. One of the ways that Great Master Dogen just put that in our the scripture that we just read, the Shushogi, he talks about, how does he say it? Impermanence offers no permanent succor. On what weeds by the roadside will the dew of our life fall? That's a nice way of looking at it. So we can take charge of our lives. We don't have to be thrown about by these things. Yeah. So the power of the Dharma and the power of sitting still and of just keeping to the precepts as best we can. So I'm just going to end with another passage from the Shushogi that we just read, where Dogen emphasizes that if we accept these precepts wholeheartedly, the highest enlightenment will be ours. And this is the undestroyable Buddhahood, which was understood, is understood, and will be understood in the past, present, and future. And this is why we say that this is an eternal law. As it works now, it's worked in the past, and it will work in the future. So have faith and just keep going one step at a time. I hope that you will find joy in the practice that you've learned here. And again, as Dogen says in the Rules for Meditation, which you read yesterday, if you do these things for some time, you will become as herein described, and then the treasure house will open naturally, and you will enjoy it fully. Homage to the Buddha, homage to the Dharma, homage to the Sangha.